Good morning, entrepreneurs, with apologies to Robin Williams in his movie career. My name is Richard Chapo. I'm an attorney in San Diego, California, and I've been representing online businesses for about the last 20 years. In today's video, we're going to take a look at another subject in our ongoing series on starting an online business legally, a step-by-step approach. And today's focus is on founders and founders agreements. So let's start just with the most basic concept. What's a founder? A founder is any person who is going to have an ownership position or a right to an ownership position at the outset of the launch of a business. And this could be some large business like Facebook, or it could be a small business where it's just you and a partner and you're launching a small e-commerce site. It can also be a business where it's a husband and wife. So we're talking, pretty general phrasing as far as the term founders goes. If you're starting a business by yourself, you are the founder. You do not need a founder's agreement because, frankly, who would it be with? It's just you. So unless you have a really bad habit of talking to yourself constantly, there really isn't any reason to have anything in writing. So let's look at one of the first issues that arises with founders. And it's one that a lot of people don't think about. And it is simply, do you need other people to help you launch your business? And the answer is almost always yes. But do you need to give those people equity? Now, equity is simply ownership in the business. You're always going to need people to help you launch a business, even if it's just a CPA. But giving away equity is usually not a smart idea unless it makes real sense, unless you're getting real value for it. Because equity is the ownership position. And once you give it away, it's gone. You can get it back potentially by purchasing it, or, there are ways to do it. But it's typically going to be expensive, and you really don't want to do that. So you should be hoarding your equity as much as possible. I often see businesses online in particular that may have 2 or 3 founders, and it seems like one of the founders is really the person who came up with the idea and is motivated to do it, and the other 2 are kind of along for the ride as emotional support, if you will. Yes, they have some skills, but nothing that couldn't be hired out independently. The person who came up with the original idea, what I call founder 1, has really only brought in additional founders because they're insecure about their idea, and they want somebody there to go along on the ride with them. Well, that's fine, but you can always hire an attorney to do that. You can hire a CPA. You could go out and hire a therapist. It doesn't matter. But giving away your equity in that position, in that situation, not sure that's the best idea. So make sure that you at least consider that and start thinking about, what are these people bringing and why am I bringing them on? Which brings us to our second subject, which is how do you find founders? And the answer to that is really, it gets a little complex, but let's try and simplify it. I think the way to find founders is to first recognize your shortcomings. When you look at your business and your business plan, where are the holes? Where are the areas where you either have no expertise at all, or that you're going to need somebody nearly full-time to run that element of the business? So let's look at an example. Let's say you're going to launch a social media site devoted to a specific niche, maybe doctors or something of that sort. That social media site is going to need to be coded. It's going to need to be updated. Errors with it are going to need to be fixed. So potentially bringing in a coder, might be an idea. However, it's not necessarily an absolute, because you can go out and hire coders. But what about maybe bringing in a physician as a part owner, or certainly as a founder, for really 2 reasons. One, to help steer you around topics that might be verboten that you might not know as a layperson. So for instance, sharing health information online about patients is going to violate a law called HIPAA, and you would need to know the ins and outs of that. Nearly every medical professional does. But the physician who comes in as a founder may also be able to guide the design of the website in the sense that they're going to know what is going to be of interest to physicians and what is not. Whereas you may not, because you're not involved in that profession. So there may be things like continuing education that you can add for specific fields. That would be a big hit, whatever those things may be. Obviously, it's going to be different for every business, but put together your business plan. Sometimes it helps to chart it out and then, identify who's responsible for what elements of the chart, what boxes. And if you have boxes that aren't filled, if you can't do them yourself, well, then you need to think about going and finding somebody who can. And really the steps there to look at are: one, can I outsource this? And two, if not, and would it make more sense to bring somebody on in exchange for equity to do that? So for instance, if you have capital of maybe 20 grand or something of that sort, and you realize that the coding of the site and doing everything you want it to do is going to run 100 grand, well, bringing in somebody to do all that coding and giving them a piece instead of money up front, may just make sense. Maybe the only way that you can launch. So these kinds of issues, and a lot of them are common sense, just think them through. But it can make a big difference in the type of founders that you get. Now, as to actually finding finders, there are a couple different ways to do it. I wouldn't just go out there and, hunt for people on a cold call basis or what have you, or off of job boards or things of that sort. You really primarily want to start with the current business that you're an employee of, and potentially vendors, things of that sort. If any of those parties fall within, a niche that would support your business model, well, you're going to know those people. So if a vendor has, somebody that does their programming and you deal with them occasionally, you may have a pretty good idea as to whether they have their crap together or not. And if they do have their crap together, and there's somebody that is responsible and gets things done in a timely fashion and so on and so forth, well, that might be somebody you want to talk to. You're looking for people that you have some kind of a history with. You have some kind of knowledge as to how they act when there's not, a potential equity position on the line. Because if there is a potential equity position on the line, or, some value there, people are going to play themselves up. It's going to be, a subjective effort, and that's not bad. That's just the nature of humanity. I'll give you an example. I'm a big hockey fan. I love the NHL. And I'm a fan of the LA Kings. And they had a player named Luc Robitaille who's now in the Hall of Fame. But when he was drafted, he was a really low round draft choice. And he was having problems getting on the ice with the Kings because there were older, better players. And the Kings went through a period where they suffered a bunch of injury to their forwards, who would stand in front of the net and try and block the vision of the goalie. It's a thankless job. You get pounded on by the defenders, and people, take shots, and the shots can hit you, and it's just not a lot of fun. But it's a very important position. And so Robitaille, recognizing the injuries, started telling the coaches and management of the Kings that he played the front of the net. He could play the front of the net, and sure enough, they said, "Really? Okay," because he's kind of a thin, small guy. But they put him out there, and so he stood in front of the net and he got pounded on. But he also had good hands, and he was able to score, a number of goals. And for the rest of his career, he became known as a net front presence player. And the irony of it was, and I'm sure you can already guess, he had never played in front of the net before in his life. He had just said that so that he could get onto the ice and get a chance to show, his goods. And so obviously it worked out in that situation. When you're talking to other people about potentially coming onto your business, as soon as they start to realize, that that's a possibility, you can expect them to inflate, themselves, to maybe exaggerate about what they can and they can't do. So, if you can get into a situation, or if you can try and find people that you have experience with their performance, when that's not an issue, those are going to be ideal candidates, because you're going to know what they do in the real world setting. That's not always going to be possible, but that's something to look at. If you're looking at, with online business, if you're looking at somebody that's doing programming, you want to see examples of what they've done. If it's web design or something of that sort, you obviously want to look at their website. If it's somebody that does SEO marketing, you can say, okay, well, that's great. What's your website? When they give it to you, go to their site, pull up the source code, look at the keywords they're trying to rank for, and then go on Google and see if they rank for those keywords. And if they're not in the top 10 for the keywords they're trying to rank for, well, why would you bring them on? If they can't get their own site up in the rankings, how are they going to get yours? So there are a lot of processes you can work through. This is an area where working with an attorney can help a lot, because we'll be able to give you some kind of ideas specific to your business and the area of the person that's coming on. So keep that in mind. And you always really, 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 want to look for performance over statements being made by people. That brings us to our next subject, which is due diligence. Oh, the glorious due diligence. So, what is due diligence? Due diligence. Due diligence is essentially the effort to investigate the founder and figure out if they're, or the founder, the potential candidate, and figure out if they're full of you know what, or if they're somebody who can legitimately help your business. Due diligence is more of an art than it is a science because it can often be difficult to learn things about people. I'll give you an example. If you say due diligence, most people will say, "Oh, you should go get references from former employers." Yeah, okay. But former employers typically are never going to say anything negative about an employee. Why? Well, they don't want to get sued for defamation. So if the employee that you're considering was a good employee that performed well and what have you, the employer will probably say something generally positive. But if they were a bad employee, the employer may well say something that's just kind of vaguely neutral or a little bit positive. And the reason for that is that employer doesn't want to invite that problem back into their life. They probably spent a lot of time and effort getting rid of that employee. So that doesn't really mean much. Now, what does mean much is that if you go through their employment history and you look at the time that they spent at particular jobs, and if you see that the candidate you're considering, moved every year or moved every 2 years, well, that might be something you want to consider as a negative because it shows that maybe they're not committed to the project at hand. What's to keep them from leaving you and going to work for somebody else. There are all these kinds of issues that you need to think through. So due diligence is really designed to try to ferret these things out. There are plenty of long articles online and checklists that you can pull up to read, things that you should look at. Due diligence really goes beyond, the scope of this video. I'll probably create a video later on for due diligence to just that subject. But before we leave it, there's two things to keep in mind. One, you might use a site called PeekYou.com to enter the candidate's name, and it should return to you most of their social media channels, their accounts. And you can go take a look at those accounts, their public records, and see how the candidate reacts to other people, maybe some of their views on politics, whatever it may be. But pay particular attention to Twitter. If you use Twitter, if you're on Twitter, there's a lot of debates, a lot of hotly debated topics, and you can get a pretty good idea maybe of the mentality of the person that you're considering as a candidate. If they fly off the handle, if they're just completely over the top in arguments, well, you might consider, is that somebody that you want in management who's going to be participating in critical management decisions, and how are they going to react if a decision doesn't go their way, those kinds of things. So Twitter accounts are almost always very enlightening and often not in a good way. So make sure to take a look at those. Now, having said all of this, due diligence is a knockdown subject. Typically you're looking for negative aspects of somebody's life. But keep in mind, nobody's perfect. I'm not perfect. I'll give you an example. The day I got my driver's license way, way back in the ancient days when I was young, I got a ticket my first day for rolling through a stop sign. Obviously not the worst offense in the world, but, humiliating. Okay, a bit funny. But it was a mistake, and it was something that technically, if you looked at my driving record, is out there. Nobody's perfect. You're not perfect. I love a quote from Oscar Wilde, who was certainly a wild man, but he said, "Never judge anyone shortly, because every saint has a past and every sinner has a future." And so I think that that's very true. If you're looking at somebody and they look like the second coming of Jesus, well, maybe you should question some of that, because nobody's perfect, and if they are, that can even be a red flag, because how are they going to react when your business runs into potential, problems and issues, which all businesses do. I mean, that's just the nature of being in business. There may be a legal change or a change in the market, that can add a lot of stress to your life. So anyways, keep that in mind. Nobody's perfect. And particularly if somebody has a mark on their record, if you will, that's from a long time ago. something from the 1995 probably should carry less weight than something from 2016. 1995, we're talking nearly, oh my God, we're talking nearly 25 years ago. Whew, I'm getting old. But that, keep in mind that there's relative weight to those kinds of things. Okay, let's move on to the Founders Agreement. So what is a Founders Agreement? Well, there's actually, technically there's a document you can call a Founders Agreement, but really what we're talking about here is a business prenup. It is an agreement that all the founders sign before the launch of the startup business. And the prenup is going to, or in this case, the founders agreement is going to cover a number of technical things, but there's some general subjects you always want to make sure are included. So you want to know, what's everybody kicking in? Is it cash, time, effort, whatever that is, be specific as possible. What are their roles and what are their obligations? What's expected of them? So you want to know, if somebody's going to work 20 hours a week or somebody's going to work 40 hours a week. So you want to make sure you nail that down. And then, and this is critically important, how will the exit of founders be handled? Because if you have multiple partners, multiple shareholders, however you want to classify them at the beginning of a business, statistically, some of them are going to flake. They may leave voluntarily. You may have to force them out. But you want to make sure you have something in writing signed by all the founders that acts as a contract up front so you can get rid of them in an orderly fashion and in a fashion that you have planned for. If you do not address this issue, if you do not have a process for booting founders, then what's going to happen is the only way you can get rid of them is essentially to go into court, into your state court. And you're going to sue to have them removed, or maybe they sue to, verify their ownership position, whatever it is. You're going to end up with a judge up on the bench who knows nothing about your business, trying to listen to the testimony of everybody, figure out who's lying, who's not lying. And then they're going to apply corporate law issued by the legislature in your state that is going to have some very almost assuredly some very odd elements to it. The end result of all of this is you usually end up with either a settlement or a court order that makes nobody happy because it doesn't recognize necessarily how the business works, and the payouts are a mess or what have you. Sometimes it can be the end of the business, just because maybe the cash payout's too much, you can't afford it, whatever. And you're also going to end up spending tons of money on attorney's fees. It's not a pleasant process. It is literally like a divorce. There will be screaming and yelling. There will be, motions to do this, motions to do that. The founder who's, questionable conduct may move the court for an order requiring the court to approve all expenses above, $100 or something. And if the court agrees, that means if you need to write a check or do an online payment for more than $100, you would have to petition the court for the right to do that. Imagine that. So yeah, it can be a nightmare. So the founders agreement is just basically a prenup, and you want to make sure that you get one. When we get into legal documents, sometimes names can confound people. So we get two common questions. One is a founder agreement the same thing as an operating agreement? And the answer is maybe. An operating agreement is essentially the bylaws of a limited liability company. The operating agreement is going to set forth how the limited liability company is run. So you would think, including the elements that you would find in a founder's agreement within the operating agreement would make sense. I generally prefer to keep them separate. Other attorneys may not. But the reason is operating agreements, depending on the requirements of your state, can get rather lengthy with boilerplate language that's required by the corporate law in that state. And so having the founders agreement separate keeps everything concise, a nice, clear document. It's much more difficult for parties to poke holes in it. But again, it's really up to your legal counsel. What about founders agreements versus shareholder agreements? So shareholder agreement is a founders agreement, and it's used with corporations, C Corps, and S Corps. And basically, it's a founders agreement by another name. Unlike an operating agreement, which really details how an LLC will be run, the equivalent of that would be the bylaws of a corporation. And you don't want to put your founder's agreement in the bylaws for the same reason as the LLC. You end up with a document that's 80 pages long, and it's easy to poke holes in. So shareholder agreement is a founder's agreement. It's just used with corporations. So that's it for today's video. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to contact me. You can reach me at SoCalInternetLawyer.com. And make sure to subscribe to this channel. We'll be doing more videos on how to launch a business online from a legal perspective, as well as other internet law topics. Probably issuing a couple of videos a week, if not more. And so hopefully you enjoyed this. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in the next video.